There once was a very religious man who was stranded alone on a deserted island. One day a ship was passing by and he managed to create a massive signal fire that caught the attention of the crew. The ship redirected their course towards the island and the man was rescued. As the captain surveyed the island, he noticed 3 large structures and questioned the man about them. The man proudly replied that one was his home and the other was his church where he worshipped daily and prayed for his rescuer to come. When the captain asked him about the 3rd structure, the man replied, "Oh, that's the church I used to go to." There is perhaps no more Christian a thing than having a church you used to go to. And despite Barry's sharp edges, he's eyeballs deep in Christianity. What often happens to an extremely intelligent and observant person like Barry when they spend decades around Christian culture is that they tend to get a little cynical. It feels like they've seen and heard it all before because most likely they have. The format of even the coolest American, European, and Australian megachurches is almost identical to that of frontier churches that spread across colonial America in the 1800s. A few upbeat songs, a charismatic sermon from a fiery preacher, and an altar call, all to collect new believers. 3 steps that a man named Charles Finney pioneered when he literally took church out of the chapel and into the theater on Chatham Street in New York City back in the 1820s, using the same routine. It was at this point that entertainment officially beat out content, as it tends to, and people left their stodgy Roman Catholic pews in droves to attend these engaging evangelical services. Fast forward to the 1980s, which Barry just referenced, when a hip experimental church in the UK started the 9 o'clock service that exploded in popularity as it catered to young artists and utilized the latest technology available to create multi-sensory effects-driven worship services more entertaining than anyone else had ever seen within the walls of a church. But something interesting seems to be happening these days. The entertainment factor isn't as powerful as it once was in its ability to captivate the souls of young believers who have seemingly seen it all before. The Barna Group reports that almost 60% of millennials who grew up in the church have left it at some point in their life. 40% of people who say they don't go to church at all explain that it's because they, quote, find God elsewhere. My question is, when did going to church become about finding God? I was raised in the church, but my most spiritual moments were never during a Sunday service. What about you? In Matthew 18:20, Jesus says, "For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them." That's church at its core. It's not some grand search for the divine, it's simply an acknowledgement of his presence amidst community. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but in LA, church seems to have become more about a place that looks cool enough to pass the test for my edgy, skeptic, non-Christian friends I'm hoping to convert than about creating a genuine space for spiritual growth and holistic healing. There's a woman named Phyllis Tickle, yes, I repeat, Phyllis Tickle, who is an expert in church history and the Christian culture. Honestly, she's a badass 80-year-old from the deep south with a well-documented love of Jack Daniels and liberal theology, so I'm a huge fan. But she has a fascinating theory about where we are today based on the fact that about every 500 years, the church and society completely shift and have what she calls a rummage sale, in which we throw out the previous ideologies in order to make way for a revolution in human consciousness. So follow me on this. Starting back around 1000 BC, you have the Davidic dynasty, which is all the major kings that all the good Christians know about, with Saul and David and Solomon and all that. And then 500 years later, you have the Babylonian captivity when shit hits the fan and Israel was completely destroyed and they all go into captivity. 500 years after that, you have the Great Transformation, which is the change of the eras and the life of Jesus. About 500 years later, you have the Council of Chalcedon and the fall of Rome. 500 years later, you have the Great Schism, and the church splits into the East and the West. 500 years later, you have Martin Luther and John Calvin, who helped spur on the Great Reformation. And 500 years later is today, is the emergent church, is the confusing and expanding and creative and identity crisis-filled church. My hope is that by acknowledging the broader context of our spirituality and understanding the patterns of religious societies that have risen and fallen before us, we can steer our communities of faith away from narcissistic tribalism and into the most beneficial, sustainable place possible. Richard Rohr describes what I think is the healthiest approach to modern emergent church culture in his book, Falling Upward. He writes, "You can belong to such institutions for all the good that they do, but you no longer put all your eggs in that one basket. This will keep you and others from unnecessary frustration and anger, and from knocking on doors that cannot be opened from the other side. In short, this is what I mean by emerging Christianity. That pretty much says it all. Now back to Barry.